Hi, I am Dr. Kim Sage. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. Welcome to my YouTube channel and to this video on the difference between complex PTSD and PTSD. If you're new here, please consider subscribing and checking that little box, and that way you'll get notified when I post new videos. And if there's any possibility you were raised by parents who struggled with some form of untreated borderline or narcissism and or emotional immaturity, you're not really sure how to heal or what to do, or you want a lot of learning and resources at your fingertips, please check out my links below and my courses on these topics. I hope you'll find them helpful if you do decide to consider taking a course, and know that I created them because of my own experience, not only as a child of these types of parents who struggled, but also as a clinician who has really specialized in these types of attachment wounds and disorders. So check those out, please. Okay, now the core issue, as I posted this week, around PTSD, as I mentioned, which is basically, it's not necessarily one event, but it's centered around that one event in general, potentially repeating itself. So what do I mean? Anything from, let's say, a robbery, as I've said, that happened in one day, maybe you were a victim of, or you witnessed it firsthand, or some kind of trauma you were exposed to very close with someone you love, or it was a repeated exposure, like let's say you're a police officer or a fire person where you're exposed to these kinds of things that are really difficult, or you were in a war. Those are still considered like one exposure, right? There's a specific identifier around the traumatic event, as opposed to complex PTSD, which is about relational trauma at the heart. So it's really about attachment wounding. It's about relationships where you should have been safe, but you were not, and often in a pattern that happens over and over again. The majority we talk about are in childhood, though you can experience complex trauma in adulthood as well. But the heart of it is that what's violated in Cptsd is your sense of belief and safety and trust, often in human beings and relationships. Now that might also happen, let's say, as if you're a victim of something in a violent event, for sure. But we're talking about repeated exposure. Oftentimes, as I'm saying, you're a child. You have no power. And so let's say your parents are untreated narcissist or borderline, and they rage, or they're loving and then very hurtful, or you walked on eggshells, and so you're very hypervigilant. Hypervigilance is a huge part, can be of both PTSD and complex trauma. Although in many cases, there's a lot of nuance and layering in a complex trauma situation, because it is coming not just, let's say, at the hands of being, let's say something happened and you were at a mall, and so malls are always scary, and so you're on guard, or schools, right, where things unfortunately happen. This is like, at any point, any human being can be unsafe, and so that translates to everything, to people, to situations, to your startle response, to your sensitivity to things like breathing and chewing. Maybe a parent sighed a lot and got angry, or you have sensitivity issues and they didn't care about those. So my point is that the way Cptsd plays out, it can be happening during these very formative years of your life. And so it really affects sort of not only your body, because now you're being exposed constantly to this rush of adrenaline and emotions, and your cortisol levels are being constantly flooded. And so what I'm really saying is that your body becomes always not only just hypervigilant in terms of what can happen, but you're being flooded with these stress hormones all of the time. And so that changes the chemistry and nature of your body. And we know that that in turn can affect all of the stuff we talk about in the ACEs studies, right? Your lifetime risk for exposure to things, or risk, I should say, of chronic illness, diabetes, heart disease, traumatic brain injury, the list goes on and on. And so you have this chemical thing happening in your body. You have this template being formed in your body with complex trauma. And so you don't necessarily sometimes even know that you have that, because that was how you had to be in your childhood. You're sort of always that way. And so with PTSD, like I said, we're talking about these events that, were happening sort of outside of you in many ways. And the problem is that, the nature of the interpersonal violation and wounding with complex trauma is something that is much harder, I think, in many ways, sometimes, depending upon the trauma, to heal from. And the truth is that most people have had at least one PTSD event at a minimum, and can often have a Cptsd as well. And so that all starts to mix together. And so you're going to see with Cptsd kind of a lot of the same symptoms you have with PTSD. So you can have flashbacks, recurrent memories, negative thoughts towards yourself, avoidance issues, isolation behaviors, irritability, recklessness, being moody, trouble concentrating, difficulty sleeping. But in addition, with Cptsd, you can have really negative, shameful view of yourself, really chronic relationship issues, maybe losing, faith in the world and belief systems, difficulty with reality sometimes, which can also happen, of course, and dissociation also in PTSD. But the core of it is you have these intense emotions, this often inner critic of yourself, this loss of belief in the world and relationships that really happens in a massive way with complex PTSD. And so we're going to talk more about what those triggers might look like. And I've made a lot of videos you can check out here about Cptsd already. But the heart of it is that your PTSD triggers might be somehow have a thread sometimes to the actual event. Whereas with complex trauma, it's tied, as I said, to human beings and to relationships in general. And that plays out in a lot of those attachment wounds, attachment dynamics of, anxiousness or avoidance or disorganization, where you've internalized that people will behave in certain ways and therefore you must behave in other ways to survive. And then you take that template and it plays out in different ways with different people based on how they respond, both from a nervous system perspective and their own attachment pattern. But the heart of it is you're often carrying these deeply relational wounds that are really about safety and trust, not just in yourself and your body and like the world, but in everything, with everyone. And oftentimes, as I'm saying, they're so subtle, you've just always been this way. It can make it hard to even know that you need therapy or that you're struggling. You might find yourself, the signals might be that you keep finding unhealthy partners and you can't figure out why things don't work out. Or you get really triggered in your parenting and you want to be a different parent, but you find yourself oftentimes going into, at least in your mind, wanting to respond the way your parents did and feeling a lot of shame about that. And so that is why identifying how this stuff shows up from trauma in general, I think is so profound. And we're going to talk more about, as I discussed in my video on anxious attachment healing, I'm going to go through how all those things, what you can work on and do in more deeper ways to help identify healing. And we'll also talk about avoidant behavior, attachment behaviors, and disorganized behaviors. So I hope to see you for all of those. Thank you so much for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I will see you on Monday. Take good care.